Hello and welcome. We're just building the audience up for the start of this exciting session. We've got over 200 people signed up, which is great. Our sessions at the Net Zero All-Party Parliamentary Group are becoming more and more popular. I'm Alex, and I'm the chair of the Net Zero All-Party Parliamentary Group, and we've got two panels today on the same topic around net zero homes, an area which now really has come to the forefront of the public mind because people clearly are suffering from the energy crisis. People are unable, in many cases, to afford their energy bills. The questions about how to heat your home this winter are right at the top of the news agenda and right at the top of people's minds. So now is the time, really, for us to redouble our efforts and talk both about how net zero homes are good for the planet and good in terms of our carbon and our NDCs and all of that, but actually maybe much more importantly now, how they will keep people warm and how they'll lower energy bills very significantly in the face of the crisis. And it's a complex and interesting area with lots of engineering talk, but I think today we're going to get a very rounded discussion. So the first panel is really around scaling up net zero homes and buildings and how can we decarbonise further and faster. But I do want the panel members to also think about the energy crisis and cost of living crisis and how, in terms of the public, how in terms of the, got a little bit of feedback here. You need to mute yourself. Okay, I think we resolved our technical problem there. But as well as the net zero, address net zero, but I also want the panelists to address the issues around cost of living, energy crisis, and affordability. So set up costs and then obviously benefits, because it's about selling the co-benefits to people about both their own finances and our net zero targets. So in the first panel, we've got four speakers. We've got Professor Aaron Gillich, who's director of the BSRIA, and Annabelle Clark, who's regional director of sustainability lead at Faithful+Gould, David Leversha, director and net zero carbon lead for property and building at WSP, is one of our partners on the net zero APPG, Kevin Garvey, head of member relations at National Housing Fed. So I think we're going to hand over first to Aaron.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for having me. My name is Aaron Gillick. I'm a professor of building decarbonization. I run the Net Zero Building Center. So my center is a joint venture that basically links up academic and industry research. And a lot of what we've been doing lately is working with local authorities and trying to help them implement their climate action plans. A lot of them have very, very ambitious plans, but are under-resourced to deliver them. So we've basically been working with them to see how they can make the most of the resources that they have and effectively doing exactly what the title of today's session is, which is going further and faster in delivering green homes. So I was asked to sort of address green myths, basically, and I thought we could maybe just throw three of them out there and then discuss it sort of more openly among the group. I would say the first myth, very quickly, these are just the top three that have emerged from working with local authorities lately on the projects that we've done together. So the first one is around fuel poverty, as Alex teed up, that this is, it's already a huge issue and is only set to grow. There are projections that about half the country will be in fuel poverty by the end of this winter. And I think we have to kind of grasp the scale of that challenge, as literally every second family is struggling to keep warm. So the myth around that is that we can kind of deal with that sort of by throwing money at the problem effectively. And I think that sort of gets the wrong end of the stick, that is that we can't just help people pay the bills, we have to reduce the bills. So it's all about demand reduction and making homes perform better. The second myth is around sort of how we do those programs. We keep doing sort of drip feed one-off programs that sort of fund measures. They're time limited, then they stop And it's kind of created this stop-start cycle that's very, very hard for the industry to sort of build momentum around. And then the third myth is on the back of that, which is around skills, which is because of that stop-start nature of a lot of our work on this over the past few decades. There is not a strong momentum in investing in skills in the workplace. So we've got a lot of really good ingredients like PAS 2035 and Trustmark and all that, but I think there's a myth out there that those things will coalesce through their own kind of market forces if we just have sustained demand for long enough. And I don't think that's going to happen fast enough in the timescales we need. So that's the third myth, is that skills will follow demand. I think we need to really accelerate how we take up skills. And certainly most of the local authorities that we speak to these days will tell you that they have a real challenge in just finding the skills locally to meet the demand that they already have. So the demand for net zero is there, and we need to find a way to help people actually deliver it. So that's my quick thinking, and I'll go to the next member of the group.
Thanks, Aaron. I think we're getting the right tone and tenor here, so it's good. It's good scene setting. So next, over to Annabelle Clark with the same scene setting question.
Thanks, Alex. And yes, I guess building on what Aaron said, my name is Annabelle Clark. I work for Faithful+Gould, who are a project and programme management consultancy, and we focus around project management, building surveying and quantity surveying. And so I guess I've got two myths that I thought I'd like to bust in this session, which are decarbonisation is too expensive, is the first one. And the second one was there's absolutely no point in decarbonising if others don't do it. And they're things that we hear in lots of meetings and around the office, and when we're speaking to clients, and I guess in personal life when we're speaking to those that we meet in social settings, looking at what to do with their own homes. I think in terms of busting that, we need to see decarbonisation as an investment, not just a cost. And I think the key thing around that is that decarbonisation journey is much bigger than just that capital cost outlay. There is a capital cost to it, and I think for many homeowners and building owners, retrofitting is a big issue, and we need to better promote access to available funding, and building on Aaron's point, make sure that they are longer term kind of funding streams that people can invest in and companies can get behind. But I think to bust those myths, really the bigger opportunities are around decarbonisation ultimately reduces the impact of climate change, which is a threat to all of our way of life, environmental, economic and social. We need to reduce operational costs, not just the carbon, and improve performance to reduce fuel poverty and the cost of living crisis. We need to also look at this as an opportunity in terms of increasing health and well-being. There's lots of added benefits to decarbonisation, such as air quality, sound insulation, lower healthcare costs. We need to look at the opportunity of creating jobs. The heat and building strategy that came out by BEIS in 2021, 175,000 new green jobs and 6 billion added to the economy. We have to look at combining investments across different streams. And I think ultimately, think about that hefty cost of doing nothing, which would be huge.
Thanks, Annabelle. There's a number of challenges there, and I think we'll probably wheel back to them at the end. So next we've got David Leversha from WSP. David, over to you.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So David Leversha, I'm Net Zero Lead at WSP. For those who don't know us, we're a large multidisciplinary engineering and consultancy business, about 70,000 worldwide and about 9,000 in the UK. So I head up the net zero team in property and buildings. So there's about 900 of us in the business who are all challenged to how to drive this debate forward. So being third, I thought I'd better have a few myths just in case others have stolen some of mine, and they already have, which is fine. So my first one, I'm going to say technology will save the day and we can all carry on as normal. Technology absolutely has a vital part to play. However, it's not the full picture, and I'll outline why. Off-site manufacturing techniques deployed by a number of housing developers, including people like Greencore, who we've worked with, are fabulous. They've got timber-framed off-site MMC solutions using hemp lime and wood fiber insulation. They basically deliver a passive house standard home, but with carbon negative embodied, because at the moment, embodied carbon isn't captured anywhere or regulated anywhere. And it's a fantastic product, and it's in demand, and we help them get a lot of funding for that product of theirs. Other companies like the Low Carbon Materials Company based out of Durham, they're actually a finalist on the Earthshot Prize just a couple of weeks ago for their low or even carbon negative materials. Heat pumps in domestic applications, we know they exist, we know they work. So the real question there is why aren't they scaling? Why are these not being adapted? And I'd put that down to behavioral change. So we need the technology, but we also need the behavioral change to drive the application and the implementation. And this is really pertinent, especially as there's a report published a couple of weeks ago in Ecological Economics that identified the risk of if we do nothing different, we'll be using 104% of our carbon budget just purely on our housing by 2050. So we really have to drive this change. And what I found interesting is the Behavioural Insights team in 2021 and their report to BEIS stated that significant behavioural change was absolutely required, absolutely necessary to drive change. And, in my mind, in this forum, what that really means is whole life carbon assessments have to become regulated. We have to be driving that whole life picture just to make sure that our renovations are done correctly and they drive down the whole life carbon associated with a product. So we really need visibility on those. And, just to really highlight that, I remember there was a Curry and Brown report back in 2019, the Climate Change Commission, that looked at the cost increase of a new home compared to the future retrofit if we just deliver homes as existing. Now that cost uplift that they reported was £5,000 compared to a future retrofit when gas is no longer available, £26,000. So when you put that into comparison of the energy hikes we've seen in the last year or so, an extra £5,000 on the average cost of a house, how much would that be saving per annum? You're almost going to be saving that money within 2 or 3 years. So those are some of the myths, and it goes back down into the cost category that I think Annabelle mentioned earlier, is that the costs have to be looked at in the whole and not just the upfront capital. So, that further, in addition to whole life carbon assessments, change in VAT. Up till now, it doesn't really, I suppose, mention new build, but, VAT at the moment is charged on refurbishments and not a new build. So we need to flip the narrative so that then refurbishing older buildings actually, that the economics starts balancing up a bit. So I've waffled on and gone on a little bit there, so I won't go on to a second one, but I'm sure we can talk about other myths that we can bust as we go through the session. So thank you.
Thanks, David. Now, poor Kevin's got the unenviable job of having to find some myths after 3 people have spoken. But National Housing Fed, generally when I meet them, have all the answers, so I'm sure you'll be fine.
Thanks, Alex. That's very kind. Yeah. There will be a little bit of not so much repetition, but I guess complementing what others have said. So if you don't know the National Housing Federation, we represent 600 housing associations across England. They represent 2.7 million homes and 6 million customers living in those homes. So a really key part of decarbonising housing stock is in our hands, as Alex has said. I'll touch on 3 myths. The first is that we can't tackle fuel poverty as part of this, and that insulation doesn't play a role. It absolutely does. There's a high percentage of housing association tenants who live in fuel poverty, around 18%. We released some research last month that showed that you could reduce bills by around 42%, saving over 700 million across those homes if they were insulated and draft proofed to the right level. So absolutely, building on what Aaron said earlier, insulation and properly retrofitting homes to the right standard is key and part of the solution, as well as our journey to net zero. Second myth is around the policy landscape and that we have the right policy architecture to push ahead. From the housing association perspective, we don't. There's certainly policy gaps that need to be addressed. The heat and building strategy is a good step forward, but as a sector, we would like to see a minimum energy efficiency standard. The majority of housing associations want to bring homes up to EPC before 2030, so the appetite's there. We need the framework and the policy foundation from government to be able to push on with that. accompanied with the right level of funding that's targeted in the right way. And the third myth is around hard to decarbonise homes. So we hear a lot that there's going to be a high percentage of homes that are just impossible to decarbonise, and one of those one of those reasons is the funding challenge, and that been a barrier to decarbonising hard to decarb homes. And again, we released some research over the summer that highlighted, with the right market interventions, with some targeted grants at things like heat pumps and new tech, actually you can bring down the percentage of hard to decarbonise homes quite significantly, really, with some quite basic interventions. And actually the scale of those hard to decarbonise homes is quite small in the first place. So it's a really key piece of research. So they're my 3 myths, and yeah, happy to chat further.
Great. So there's a lot to pick up there. But I'm going to start with a thought that struck me from what Kevin said. So and actually it fits in with what Annabelle said about benefits. Invest and then we think about the benefits post-investment in terms of decarbonising homes. So for social landlords, for private owners, I can absolutely see that. But if you're a landlord in the private rented sector, particularly in an area of high demand like my constituency, where private rented sector homes outstrips supply, you're investing, not gonna, you're gonna rent the house out, the investor or not. The benefit will then accrue to the tenant. So how are we going to resolve private rented, which is huge and growing part of the housing market? So how are we going to get those homes to net zero? So what are the potential? Talk about behaviour change. So David mentioned about behaviour change. How are we going to change behaviour of private rented sector landlords in areas of high demand? Would anybody like to thought on that? Yeah, David.
I'll go first on that. Well, I think most people have a budget, and when they're looking at their living costs, they'll be looking at their rent, but also the running cost of any property they are actually renting. So if their bills are next to nothing, because maybe the property is up to passive house standard or there or thereabouts, and they're not spending 50, 100, 200 pounds a month, whatever it is, on their rental property, depending on whether it's a small 1-bed or family home, then that's additional money that the landlord can be putting on the rent. Put it quite concisely, that the benefits of not having that outgoing from your heating and lighting can be charged elsewhere.
That is a good argument. You can charge more rent if you have lower running costs of the house. That is the first time I've heard that, so thanks, David. Aaron, did you want to come in on that one?
The private rented sector is one of the areas where there are regulatory drivers for retrofit around the minimum energy performance standards. And I think what a lot of local authorities have struggled with is trying to kind of keep up, basically, and enforce them. And so there's been a lot of exemptions registers, and there's just not always a lot of bandwidth with local authorities to sort of chase them up and hold them to it. And the rental market is better described as a feeding frenzy. I think everyone needs a home. There's not a lot of options. Sometimes you have to take a home before you can even see the home, so it's very difficult. Basically, renters are in a very poor negotiating position on this one, and that's why those regulations are there. So I think any help we can do to help local authorities enforce those and make it more fair is a good thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I was only going to add to that. I think although right now in the PRS market, the supply outstrips the demand, I think we have to think further ahead. And so actually having a home that exceeds standards will help future-proof it. So actually you'll end up with a home that actually in future markets where climate change, changes in temperature, changes in weather events are a real reality. You want those houses to be future-proof, to have the right thermal comfort, the right acoustics, the right health and well-being elements included in them, so that they retain their market value and don't become stranded assets in the future.
That's really interesting. It's interesting how we communicate that to people. If I knock on the door and say, "Oh, you've got a very draft this, I've got a draft home sale," well, that'll be a stranded asset in the future. That they'll probably just look at me very blankly. So you need to think about how we package that and how we communicate that with people. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I talk about stranded assets all the time, not usually in context of housing, but I think it's not something that's yet in the lexicon of everyday life. But something else that David said was about the cost of retrofit. That actually, if we leave retrofit until later, the cost will escalate rather than do it now, do it early. And that obviously is even bigger in new build. If you leave the future tech, and we know some developers, not all, are looking at the cost to build, and they will tend to maybe not future-proof the homes because of the costs involved, but obviously the retrofit much later on is much more expensive. So, obviously the regulation is one important way to do that, particularly with new homes, but also in certain markets like private rental market or with social landlords. But how else can we work towards ensuring that we get the retrofit at the earliest possible stage rather than people putting it off? I'm a homeowner, and apart from insulation, I put everything else off because the drivers aren't there and the costs are huge. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Who wants to start there? David, maybe you do, because that was yours. That thought struck me from what you were saying.
Well, the real challenge here is it's that convincing people, and it's that education piece that that investment up front is worthwhile. As humans, we discount the future very heavily, which is why lots of us probably don't invest as much as we should, maybe in our pensions and things like that. So trying to change that narrative, that looking after the future by looking at the here and now, is really challenging, because we're hardwired not to do that as individuals. But it is about highlighting the benefits, and that there's a lot of money that's being spent now to pay people's bills. How can we direct some of that into reducing the demand? How can we direct some of that money into the long-term schemes that Aaron mentioned at the beginning, to make sure that there's a constant flow of the same initiatives, so then it breeds that confidence into the market to upskill, to provide the training that's required. There's some great initiatives out there, like the National Centre for Heat Decarbonisation that I think it's Birmingham University are looking at, and that's going to drive standards, but also the training. And that whole training piece needs to be scaled dramatically. I think, what was it, 600,000 heat pumps per year by the end of this decade, and 1.9 million by 2035. That's a huge opportunity to be driving down the energy demand and carbon, and also reducing the costs to the inhabitants dramatically. So it is about that communication piece very, very urgently.
So,
Aaron, sorry, I muted myself there.
yeah, I think picking up on something David said there, that a lot of our efforts seem to go towards kind of just paying people, to helping support paying energy bills, and that's the way we address the problem, as opposed to really helping reduce the bills to begin with, and reducing demand. And I think that's got to be the way that we approach this. We've kind of coasted, I think, as for a long time now, on the back of cheap fossil fuels that kind of let us sweep under the rug a lot of these other performance questions, and we don't really think about how energy in our home is related to comfort and health and all these other factors. And so I think the way to think about this from a cost point of view is to just start that as a journey, that people start to understand how their health and their home and the sort of what they spend on energy is all interlinked, and make the small changes up front that you can, and use those as part of a sort of longer journey towards the deeper retrofit measures. But it's really, I think we're at the beginning now of a transition in how people think. Like we think and talk about energy and comfort a whole lot more than we did a year ago. And so our job is to help sort of keep people along that journey as effectively as we can.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think you're absolutely right. I think people are moving on that journey with us, although maybe not quite in the same way that we're moving, but we're all moving towards the same agenda. It's the same goal. So actually, Clive Betts is going to be late. So what we're going to do is we're going to extend this panel a little, and we're going to take questions from the floor. So you can either type them into the webinar chat or put your hand up and I'll bring you in. And we have both of those already. So I'm going to start with a question in the chat, and then I'm going to go to Sagar Shah has put their hand up. So the question from David Cowdery, the panel, is: the future home standards being drafted and due to be introduced in 2025. We all agree that homes need the highest levels of insulation and energy efficiency. We also need to make sure that no new homes are connected to the gas grid after 2025. There's a good challenge. And that builders are required to install heat pumps, solar sufficient PV, battery storage and EV charging points in every new home, another good challenge. Do you also agree that any renewables being installed to the best industry standards, MCS or higher, to provide consumer confidence renewable technology in new homes are fit for the future? So it's a question about what those homes standards for those future homes should look like, and then basically that is basically it, and where we need to get to from 2025. We've obviously, this is something I say, we have already flunked this twice, because there was the Code of Sustainable Homes which got scrapped, and then there's again the previous attempt at net zero homes which was scrapped because of elections. And I don't need to make a political point here. I think we all know what happened. So this will be our third go, and we have to get it right this time, because we should have got it right 15 years ago. So who wants to start on David's question? Aaron, you look like you're ready. Yeah, there.
Sure. I didn't want to. I think it's interesting. So, I mean, as a kind of baseline, prima facie, we've got to get that right, kind of thing. Like what they describe in the Future Homes comment there in question, I feel is the absolute bare minimum of where our conversation needs to be at this. And if anything, I mean, to be honest, I'd be amazed if we get to 2025 still having the same conversation, because it's getting colder, it's getting more expensive. We're going to have people, as we were just sort of talking about, thinking about this a whole lot more actively. And I feel like the push for lower carbon homes, the demand for lower energy homes, is going to be just so much a part of the discourse that by 2025, we're going to find, as I say, that's the bare minimum people are looking for by that point.
Thanks. Anybody want to comment on this before I bring in another?
Well, yeah, I'll just add to that, I suppose, in terms of that public perception. BEIS had a attitudes tracker to the climate emergency in the spring of this year. And I think it was 84% of people say that they were either fairly concerned or very concerned about the climate emergency. So, more and more people are going to be demanding far better from their properties. And when I asked my team as to the future home standards, the one thing they really flagged was the need for airtightness, because whilst insulation is fantastic, if it's not well constructed and made sure that it's airtight, you can undo a lot of that quality and that good. So it is about making sure that they're airtight and well constructed. And again, that goes back to the skills piece that we were mentioning earlier. Airtightness is notoriously hard and tricky. So we've got to make sure that the designs that are being put out there and being, constructed are being constructed to robust airtightness standards. So then all the good work isn't undone because a little bit of detailing or it's a Friday afternoon job when it's being constructed. So we've really got to make sure that it's really fit for purpose.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think it's great that the future home standard is coming in, but it has to go far enough that we don't have to retrofit in the future, because otherwise we're just adding to more of the challenge. So I think there is far more that can be done. I think the future home standard is brilliant in terms of the design construction of the building. I think a lot more could be done around the in-use and operation of a building when we look at the whole life. And I think the other quite interesting thing, I know you just picked up on there, Alex, was obviously Code for Sustainable Homes. While, of course, it wasn't a success, what it did cover was much wider holistic sustainability. And I think that we probably need to look at that quite a lot in conjunction with energy and carbon as well.
Just to finish that point off, Alex, as well, really briefly, that housing associations are already building to the future home standard, and there's some really good learning coming out of the sector. There's a fantastic development by Midland Heart in Edgbaston where they're looking at tenant behaviour around the homes they're building, the tech they're using, working with tenants to improve the livability. A slight challenge on David's point about airtightness that I think someone in the comments has made around the links to having homes that don't have ventilation and maybe too airtight, and the links there to damp, mould and condensation and the quality of the fabric of the home overall, but generally agree with that.
Yeah. And can I just also add that again, that whole embodied carbon piece, we can be really supportive of regenerative design here by looking at some more natural based materials. I mentioned hemp lime earlier. That can really feed in and support the local economies, because hemp is a real wonder material. It can act in the fourth crop rotation, so it can feed back into the soils. So, you know, we need to be looking, you know, not just at carbon, but beyond into, you know, how do we really help, you know, our ecosystems regenerate? So, you know, let's start looking at using more natural materials in those products and in those buildings where we can. And, you know, medium to low rise buildings, absolutely, we can be looking to be using more natural, you know, timber, limecrete, etc. They're the perfect buildings for those materials.
Thanks, Dave. Right, we're gonna go some questions from the attendees. I'm really pleased that Afzal Khan, who's a member of Parliament for Manchester Gorton's here. Manchester Gorton has one of the highest levels of fuel poverty in the country, and you know, the housing stock's got a lot of Victorian terraces, a lot of post-war social build, a lot of quite hard to retrofit housing, and combined with large amounts of fuel poverty. I'm sure Afzal will speak a bit more about that and about some of the challenges and what he might be seeking. So I'll over to Afzal. I think I don't know how we bring him in, but I'll leave Louis to work that out, the technical bit.
He's able to speak if he is here. If he's not here, then
He's here. If you look at the antenna, he's at the top of my screen, and the officer said he can.
Okay, sorry to disappoint everyone. I'm Yasmin from Afzal's office. He's in another meeting right now, but obviously wanted to attend because of how important this is to our constituents here. Like Alex mentioned, we have current estimates are probably more likely to be around 50% of the constituency being in fuel poverty, and a very high portion of those are in social housing. And the number of constituents we currently see on pay-as-you-go meters is increasing exponentially as well. So it's a massive issue. We do have some housing more locally on the other side of Manchester that is, I believe it's, I want to say it's carbon neutral, but I could be wrong. So it's kind of the first carbon neutral housing in the Northwest, which is amazing. And I think that's what we really need to be seeing more of to keep people in homes for a longer period of time without struggling. And I guess more generally, yeah, I think our constituents in general can't afford to retrofit their houses. I think the current estimates that GMCA have produced are about £27,000 to retrofit a mid-terrace Edwardian home, which is significantly more than a lot of people have, but especially people in impoverished areas. So I guess this is something else to look at, is schemes that provide for people whose retrofitting will cost so much money, and how do we do that? And how do we do that to make sure if it has to be repaid, that it's affordable to be repaid over time as well? But yeah, any questions? Sorry, I'm not Afzal, but we do speak about this regularly. So yeah, happy to provide any other information anyone's interested in.
Thanks, Yasmin. I think that outlines something like a microcosm of the challenge in some of our urban areas, and the housing stock and the challenges that we are gonna have. So actually, I've got another question. I'll come back to the people putting their hands up, but from the chat, which I think is an excellent question from Emma Woods. How does the panel think the sector can unlock some of the challenges around limited supply chain and skills? And they're probably even more limited now we're post-Brexit, but you can or cannot comment on that as you see fit. So who'd like to take that one to start with? Aaron?
Yeah, so this is an area that a lot of local authorities are very, very aware of and are doing isolated pilots that are all really effective in their own right, you know, working with groups of local partners, sort of leveraging all the sort of boots on the ground and making these things sort of work at a local level. And I think what a lot of them struggle with is kind of reinventing the wheel sometimes, is trying to kind of, everybody's doing their own pilot instead of us having a kind of wider strategy that helps each other out. And it would be much more effective for us to kind of deliver this as a kind of national strategy, really, where we're all helping each other and making progress together. And I think that what I think we need to avoid is thinking of everything in isolation. The sort of the skills is one piece. It's absolutely essential. There's another question about the funding, and you were just speaking just now about the 27,000 per home. There's no avoiding that this is going to be a cost most people can't bear, particularly right up front. and that we need a kind of longer term look at how we fund these kinds of things. And whenever people have looked at a national strategy in a holistic way, there are always, for every public pound that is spent, at least 2, if not more, pounds that are returned to the kind of the economy through these knock-on benefits. So we need to kind of start believing those numbers when those strategies are put out there, and take a good long-term view of how we build the financing picture and the skills picture together.
I mean, absolutely, for owner-occupiers. I mean, some of the things we've been talking about in the past are, and actually it seems more appropriate now with very high energy bills, is you don't receive the savings of the repayment, and then householders don't have upfront costs, or they have it like a mortgage. You have a deposit, and then the rest is taken out, a little bit on that model. But that's a difficult model to design. The government would have to get involved in that. It couldn't be just the private sector that does that. So there's a challenge there, but it's not a challenge I think that we'll see in the next few weeks with the current government, but something to think about. But David, WSP must come up against this sort of question around skills and supply chain all the time.
Yeah, and I think one, goes back to that confidence that there's going to be a long-term business model there for people, which is why we need the long-term strategies in place and the funding there. So I mentioned Green Core. We undertook an embodied carbon review on their product, and it's an off-site manufactured product like many others out there. But based on what they were offering, they secured £500 million worth of investment from M&G, and I'm living up in Leeds, and there's the Climate Innovation District, and up here, again, that's a fantastic scheme. We're not involved in it, but where they've basically created a factory on site to make the houses in a factory environment, and then they just wheel them 100 meters across the site and then start erecting them. So schemes like that provide those high quality jobs, but they're not the dirty jobs that might disincentivize people to go into that sector. You're not going to be held to ransom by bricklayers moving from one site to another for an extra 50p 1,000 bricks being laid, etc. So it provides that continuity and the better high quality jobs if you can really embrace the modern methods of construction to their maximum, because you then get the economies of scale, and you can deliver more for less, essentially, because you can get it on a production line. So it's incentivizing people to do that. And that's why I go back down to the embodied carbon angle, because off-site construction invariably for housing is far better suited to timber framed and more natural products, rather than trying to bind together masonry and bricks and cart them across once you've prefabricated them. So it's kind of all interlinked, but you have to give that long-term market so people invest in those factories, and then you'll attract the skilled, and you can train people up to deliver.
Great. I mean, you've hit one of my subjects of passion there, the situ climate innovation district in Leeds. Actually, when I was on the local authority, very strongly helped seed that project. Another similar project which I was involved with is the Goodwin Community Homes low carbon modular project in Hull, which is a housing association based project. So Kevin, maybe you can give a sort of perspective from housing associations around this issue and how they're dealing with the skills gaps and the supply chain issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund has actually been a really good opportunity to address that point that Aaron talked about a strategic approach to decarbonising homes. And we've got in particular small and medium-sized housing associations working in consortium, utilising the funding from the Social Housing Decarb Fund, and actually been able to decarbonise homes at some scale. And hopefully that'll continue with Wave 2. I mean, big challenges definitely in terms of skills and supply at a local level. Housing associations are looking at how they retrain staff up to past 2035 accreditation, making sure their workforce is pivoting away from traditional repairs and maintenance towards the repairs and maintenance and installations we need around retrofitting and decarbonising homes, partnering with local FE colleges as well, not just as an individual housing association, but part of a regional group, and utilising, making sure the right skill sets are coming through into housing associations that are going to be the skills we need in the future. So there's lots of really good examples of what the sector is doing.
Okay, so we've got time for one more in this session. So I'm actually going to bring in Sagar Shah, who's got their hand up. So Sagar, over to you. Oh, Sagar's muted. Nah, there we are. Go, off you go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep. Carry
Right.
on.
My question was, so my roots are from India and Africa, and when people talking about the renewables, my speciality interest is supply chains. So when I've been presented with these solutions of renewables for the last 5-10 years, I've been tracking and tracing what's the supply chain of all the resources, the cobalt, the bauxite, and the lithium for these renewables. And also that small amount of engine oil, which is from diesel in the engine of the wind turbine. And so much fossil fuels required to be burned across the whole supply chain of renewables, wind, solar, and electric, massively leaving us massively exposed in the UK. We've gone from divesting from fossil fuels, which is just up the road from North Sea, to now relying on those energy products coming from Africa and India. So my question is how have we increased our resilience in the UK, the British Isles, when David, you just mentioned before I come on, you mentioned about hemp. I'm glad you did mention that. What really irks me is that when I see a hemp house with a solar panel on top, and I was like, you didn't need to do that. The hemp house was sustainable, but the solar panel, you had to destroy someone else's forest to get the lithium out of the ground or the bauxite. So to further David's comment about hemp, and also here's a solution for inflation. We're getting all these products made and mined in China, made in Africa. What are we actually making in the UK? If you want to stem off inflation, we need to start making stuff. What the thing that we can make and we can farm and we can grow, we've got it right in the UK. It's called hemp. The Irish have been doing it for 30 years. The Scots are starting to do it. I know Welsh farmers passionate about it. They keep getting stuffed over by the government not supporting their subsidies. But how do we support all 4 regions of the UK and the British Isles to say, we've got the history, we've got the expertise, we've got the materials. Here is real provenance. And then when the rest of the world sees Britain doing it, what happens? Everyone starts copying the UK.
Okay, thanks, Sagar. So is hemp the answer, I suppose, is the question. David, do you want to start us on that?
It's definitely part of the solution, I would suggest. You know, we delivered 7 or 8 years ago the Bright building at the University of Bradford, and I went to visit it a couple of weeks ago because that's got apparently the largest monolithic hempcrete wall in the world. You know, and it looks fabulous. You would not tell that it was a natural based wall in this wonderful. This helps. So is part of the solution. But what I think the bigger part of that question is about the need for an environmental product declaration and the need to drive that through our supply chain so that we understand the real impacts associated with the products we're specifying and that we're designing and also procuring. And that goes back to that whole life carbon assessment requirement that I mentioned earlier, and that desperate need for Part Z that I know was debated in Parliament a week or so ago. You know, that is absolutely critical because, you know, with something like Part Z behind us, it gives the weight to start, you know, really driving the need for EPDs. We then drive that into the supply chain. And once you start measuring carbon, you're able to start reducing it. And that is the key element to this, as well as all the other side issues associated with, you know, we're using 3 planets worth of materials in Europe at the moment. You know, America's using 5. We've got to get that down to 1. So hemp's part of the equation, EPDs, whole life carbon, because it goes hand in hand with the circular economy. And I mentioned the low carbon buildings material company earlier. With their moonshot prize, or sorry, runners up place that they were getting. You know, we've got to look at that circular economy, and we have to start, you know, mining what we've got if and when we need to demolish buildings, which is always the very last essence. How can we use those materials better? You know, we've been driving the reuse of structural steel really hard in the UK. We're now doing that elsewhere as well. But, you know, how do we really mine those materials and get them back into the marketplace?
Thanks, that was really useful. So I had my meeting before this actually was on green taxonomy and embedded carbon. That probably could also provide part of the solution, and particularly around state subsidy. I think probably now we need to move on to the next panel because Jade's got to go at 3 p.m. So if we can bring in Jade Lewis from the Sustainable Energy Association, Daniel Newport, who's Director of Net Zero at the Tony Blair Institute. And I think we're just going to hand straight over to you, Jade, because I'm very aware of the time.
Oh, that's really good. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, I'm Jade Lewis. I'm Chief Executive at the Sustainable Energy Association. And for those of you who don't know us, we're a membership organisation with expertise on energy in buildings. And we're there to help create living and working spaces fit for future generations. So this means that they're energy efficient, net zero carbon, but also warm and healthy. And we're also sponsors of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Healthy Homes and Buildings. And I personally helped to produce their white paper, which was laying the foundations for healthy homes and buildings. And given that we spend 90% on average of our time indoors, the indoor environment contributes directly to our health and well-being. And it's astonishing to note that the cost of leaving people in poor housing is in the region of £18 billion per year. This demonstrates the real need for change, and we need to be building homes and buildings that are healthy for people. And we've got a real opportunity, I think it was said earlier, while we're addressing net zero, to also think about how we can promote positive health and well-being while also addressing that net zero. So energy efficiency plays a significant role, but healthy homes and buildings are about much more. And we've talked already about things like thermal comfort, air quality, acoustics, lighting, views of the outdoors. So also we've seen that we're focusing on carbon alone with other schemes has, without paying due care and attention to other factors, has led to unintended consequences. Overheating, poor air quality, mold and moisture, all known quality problems when this goes wrong. So it's really important that we don't just focus on the carbon alone. And of course, safety should be foremost as well. Now, the white paper sets out key policy asks to help deliver healthy homes and buildings. So this relates to the question, what are the policies that we need in place? So firstly, we need the government and local authorities to make health and well-being a top priority. And it'd be great to see the UK government replicate the legislation passed in Wales. Their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act requires public bodies to think about the long-term impact of their decisions to prevent persistent problems such as poverty, health inequalities, and climate change. We also need the government to join up the relevant departments and agencies who have an interest in health and retrofit and design of buildings with clear ownership from them. A national retrofit strategy is then required to set out plans to retrofit the current UK building stock. Our building stock is some of the worst performing in Europe, and the strategy should take a whole holistic approach, start with the building fabric and address other building requirements. So we need to think about health and well-being there, things like thermal comfort, air quality, lighting and acoustics. And to do this, we need improved tools. So we'll need things like building passports that clearly set out the improvement measures required for a particular building. An EPC certificate on its own doesn't do this. We need to stop building homes and buildings that are energy inefficient, and this will prevent us having to spend time and money later on retrofitting them. So we need a national optimum standard for new buildings. It's mentioned already, but we also need the knowledge and skills, particularly around health and well-being, to add into the net zero knowledge as well, so that it becomes standard practice to consider health and well-being in policy making, but also in designing new builds and also on retrofit projects. Industry and government should work together to raise public awareness about the link between the built environment and health and well-being. And this would help create consumer demand for home improvement measures and start to create a market for net zero, as well as healthier homes and buildings. And finally, we should measure the impact from current and future new build and renovation schemes to build the political, economic and business case as evidence into future policy-making decisions, so that health and well-being truly is at the forefront of the government's decision-making process. A little bit of a summary from me.
Thanks, Jay. That was a very full summary. We may just about have you for the first question, which I hope. But I'll move on to Daniel. And Daniel, which I didn't mention, is also formerly the head of heat and building strategy at BEIS. So I'm really interested in hearing your ideas for future policy in this area. So over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Alex. So look, I thought I'd just start by I mean, you asked for some further myths, and we've had a lot, but there are a few more that percolate and are percolating particularly at the moment that I think are important to kind of knock on the head. There's obviously a lot of people talking about how this energy crisis is a sort of call to action for low carbon buildings, and I think it clearly is. Most of us probably on this call, most people in the country will be thinking, what can I possibly do to bring my bills down, bring my energy use down right now? And that's an opportunity as policymakers that really hasn't been there. But it's also a really difficult time because that same set of conditions means that householders are really short of money. And we know that this is a set of changes that are going to cost money, and they're going to cost money up front. And so what we probably have at the moment is policymakers really stuck between a rock and a hard place. For the first time, there's real public appetite for action, but the ability to make that action happen, both in terms of personal finances, but also the public finances, has been very quickly eroded. And so that means, I think, that the government needs to start taking a really long-term view here and not get too caught up in just the sort of crisis response sort of mentality that frankly helped precipitate the current conditions. It needs to start thinking 10, 15, 20-year view. But we should also recognise that while the government's getting a lot of criticism from many sort of directions about not having done enough or not doing enough on demand response, we need to look at why that is the case. There are real barriers to rapidly rolling out low carbon homes across the country. We've heard a lot of those today, whether they're about skills, whether they're about information, whether they're about access to capital, and really getting those conditions right in the form of reforming retail markets, training new installers, providing low-cost finance, better information. Those are things that need long-term investment, not just they're not quick wins. They need a program of work that enables that market when it's ready to really take off. What does it actually look like when you get there? Well, I think what we've heard from pretty much every panelist so far today is that there is an upfront cost problem here, right? Not many households are able to reach into the back pocket and finance a retrofit that's going to get them anywhere near, let alone all the way to, a net zero building. And where policy has gotten really stuck, I think, in recent years, is on how we help householders that aren't in the most immediately obvious financial disadvantage. So we have got policies that are working pretty well on social housing, need to be scaled up. We have got policies working reasonably well on fuel poverty, need to be scaled up. But then there's this huge mass of 80% of homes which are often referred to as the sort of able to pay category. And I don't think they are able to pay in many respects. At least they're not able to pay just upfront with readily available cash. And so that's where I think three things are needed. Firstly is a retail market that is essentially, so I'm talking about energy retail here, is essentially designed to incentivize and deliver improvements to people's homes rather than just sell them energy. That's going to be really, really important. That's going to see us develop lots of new business models, lots of new consumer offers. It's going to help us spread the cost over time. To go with that, I think government needs to provide a blended package of support, probably a combination of loans and grants. And that's going to need to be done in a way which sort of leaves the sort of boom and bust cycles of the past behind and starts to develop a sustainable framework of funding. It's also probably going to need to be means tested, because we know that the simple maths of kind of, are you in fuel poverty, aren't you, don't really work for helping households outside of those populations. But a means test needs to be a lot more about access to capital. It needs to be a lot more about the level of affluence and equity of a household, not just where they are on the earnings spectrum, because different people are in different circumstances. If you get those right, then I think we can start to have a conversation about regulation. And ultimately, regulation is going to be needed if we're going to move from where we are today to where we're talking about being in 2050, with almost all, if not all, of our homes at low carbon levels. We've talked a little bit about what that looks like in the private rented sector, but being able to expand that into point of sale regulations in owner occupied homes, being able to push those regulations in private rented and social housings further, those require that kind of policy framework that supports household being in place first, but they do need to come, and bringing them in means, I think, firstly, being very clear with the public about where we're trying to get to by 2050. It means a backstop that sets down in regulation what we're actually ultimately aiming for, and does it in as unprescriptive a way as possible, because frankly, you know, different households are going to need different interventions to get there. So that means work on metrics, it means work on supporting policies. What is required essentially, without wanting to disappoint, is not a silver bullet therefore, but a whole holistic framework of policy that really is going to take time to develop. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Daniel. That was very full. We've got some questions in the chat, not hands yet. Sagar's hands up, but I think that's a legacy hand from the earlier hemp-related question. But as we've got Jade, I'll ask this question and she can respond, then she'll probably need to go. So the first one's from Ben Beanland. I say that energy policy need a 50-year outlook. We now have just 28 years. What we cannot afford is a series of 5-year energy policies. Oh, I've just lost the question. Each one fundamentally different to the one which came before. Long-term policy, yeah, I'm trying to read all of that. Long-term policy is moving too quickly for me. Hold on. Long-term policy for workforce and for building the financial environment that will make decarbonisation affordable for all. Does the panel agree we need stable long-term policy and affordability package of lend-lease proportions? Jade, over to you.
How can you not agree? It's one thing that comes up time and time again. It doesn't matter what all-party parliamentary group you're in or what topic you're talking about. What industry needs to deliver what the government wants is long-term policy. And unfortunately, the politics does kind of get in the way of that. And understandably, we live in a democracy. But any kind of long-term policy gives confidence to the industry. It allows us to invest. Especially in things like manufacturing, you're going to need all these products. Even if they're natural, you'll need to convert these products. So you need to be able to invest. And people in manufacturing need 10, 15 years of certainty before they put millions and millions of pounds into investing in new factories and equipment. And then there's the skills agenda as well, and the knowledge agenda. So anything we can do to get long-term policy is always really, really welcomed. Obviously, you want good joined up long-term policy as well. I'll leave it at that because I do have to go, but thank you for the opportunity. It is a hugely important topic, and we do need to remember things like health and well-being, broader sustainability. That all needs to be included when we're talking about net zero, or we will get it wrong. We're focusing too narrowly.
Thank you very much, Jade. I think what we're going to do now is bring back the first panel, because otherwise Daniel will be a bit lonely in responding to these. But if you want to respond to that one as well, Daniel, and then we'll move on to some more questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Jade summarised it well there, and it aligns very much with what I was saying, that there is a need for a long-term framework. I think the big question is, how do you achieve a long-term framework in a parliamentary democracy? I think that speaks to the need for institutions beyond Parliament in helping to provide that certainty. I think it also speaks to the importance of regulatory drivers, both in terms of on consumers, but also within markets, that can be set up in a way that less, they're obviously susceptible to political change, but less routinely. I think the reliance on kind of just subsidy alone is really what creates this kind of boom and bust cycle that markets frankly don't react well to.
Great. I'll actually move on to the next question because it's specifically to you, Daniel, but I'll bring the others in as we see fit there. I can see them. I'm not sure that everybody else can see them or not, but I can see them. So it's from Alex Baines, and it's how about the government invest in the assessment and medium-term plan element of retrofit? This will enable financial institutions to have more certainty in the work to be done, the manufacturers to know where R&D needs to focus, the industry to invest in people and skills that they know will be required as demand can be demonstrated. And most of all, allow policy to be understood. Allow policy to understand what is really needed.
Yeah, well, I think to an extent, this is what government tries to do when it puts out long-term strategies, like the heat and building strategy, is it's trying to give some certainty about what the kind of fixed points are of this transition. So targets like the 600,000 heat pumps by 2028, like EPCC by 2035, are intended to give these kind of market signals. I think there's two risks with them. The first is whether they're credible in the first place, and that means that, you know, investors need to, and households and businesses need to believe that at that point in time they are going to actually happen. And I think one of the problems we've had across net zero is that that hasn't always happened. And each time a target comes around and it's not implemented, that undermines not just confidence in investing for that target, but all other government targets and all other government strategies. So one of the key examples of this was the zero carbon buildings policy. We're talking earlier about, you know, are our new builds going to be completely zero carbon, non-needing retrofit by 2025? Well, we once said they were, I think, by 2015, and then pulled out. And those kind of, that kind of sends shockwaves through time, if you like, on whether these kind of strategies are worth more than the paper they're written on. And that's why I say I think you need to find a way of codifying those strategies quite quickly for them to be really valuable in the market. You need to be able to find ways of putting them into regulation. You need to be able to find ways of making them at least as far as possible apolitical.
We've got David, Aaron, and Annabelle still here from our first panel. Do any of you have perspectives on that question?
Yeah, well, just following up, I think what I find a bit bizarre about some of this is always that you know, early adopters in a lot of transitions are the ones who, you know, really reap the benefits. And I don't want to be talking about the green economy, blah blah blah, as someone famous once said, but the early adopters here will be the ones who have, you know, safeguarded their businesses going forward. I think Annabelle mentioned it earlier about the stranded assets. You know, if you're a business and you're reliant on, you know, concrete block works and bricks to be building your buildings, where are we going to be by the end of this decade when, you know, our carbon budget may well be passed down to planning authorities to decide, right, we've got X 100,000, you know, tons of carbon this year, where are we going to invest that? You know, is that going to be in a new hospital, or is it going to be in achieving our housing targets? And, you know, housing should be seen as one of the solutions to the challenge, because you can be delivering, you know, carbon negative buildings now. So, you know, if you're delivering those carbon negative buildings with, you know, natural based products, passive house standard, you know, you're part of the solution. And, you know, that's a real business imperative to be at the front of the curve there. You know, and one of my other myths that I was going to put out there was, you know, is throwing heat pumps into our old building stock the answer to everything? And ultimately it isn't, because we know that you can't just put a heat pump, plug it in instead of your gas boiler. So again, those arbitrary 600,000 or 1.9 million by a few years in the future, it's not the whole answer. You know, we need to upskill the industry, and that includes the tradespeople, to go in and undertake surveys and assessments on housing. What is the best way to upgrade the different types of housing stock we have in this country? Because there's hundreds of different thousands of different types of buildings. You know, we need to mobilize, and this is where, you know, your small businesses have that opportunity. If they can see there's a 20-year timescale, they will invest, they will upskill themselves, and they will deliver.
Thanks, David. That's really, really helpful and sort of holistic response. Aaron or Anna, have you got any thoughts on this? Because I've got a couple more questions. Aaron?
Yeah, that holistic element, I think, and sort of, I completely take Daniel's point. He's absolutely right. We are burned of the policy kind of changes of the past. One of my favorite quotes from a workshop we ran on this was that I just want one government program that doesn't leave us all in tears. I thought that summed it up pretty well. But what does change, when you look at the future home standard for 2025 and all that, what does change along the way is kind of reality and the world that we live in. So I think we are going to be looking at these things all quite differently. The heat waves are getting longer, the cold spikes are getting colder, the cost of living is going up. And so the lens through which we view all these things is very different, and will continue to change in a kind of an accelerating way. That's what scientists have been predicting for decades would be exactly the case. And we're starting to see that now quite vividly. And so I think we are going to experience this change one way or the other. And the question is, how do we kind of make our communities fit for purpose as we go along? And I think there will be an expense. So we've talked about this quite a bit across these panels. And it's very true, there will definitely be an expense. And the way to people's hearts and minds is to show how this is now an opportunity to right sort of longstanding wrongs and how our built environment sort of engages with us, those elements of whole life value that have come up over and over again. So I think I think somebody already said it, that phrase of the cost of not doing it is what we have to think about as well.
Absolutely.
Can I just jump in there too? I was just going to say on the early adopters piece, I think the other piece that we're massively we're missing, but we are collecting slowly, but is data. And I think, you know, on so many of these you know, panels like this or the documents that are coming out, you know, it's brilliant. I think we all know what we should do. We all know why we should do it and what the benefits are, but we don't always have all of the data to sit behind that to kind of prove some of those benefits. And I think it's that evidence that people are really after, and then probably better communication of those benefits to all parties, but making it personal to them. So I think collecting the data and better use of the data that we then collect.
Yeah, absolutely. Data is a whole other piece, which probably could do an event on its own. I'm going to go. I've got a question which I know very little about, and if none of you know anything about it, it'll be a very short answer, but hopefully one of you does. From Julian, what do the panel think of the German KfW Bank energy efficient construction refurbishment program retrofit financing model? Because financing this transition to housing is obviously a huge part of this, and if somebody's got a good model, why shouldn't we copy it? Does anybody have any knowledge or insight into that? Otherwise, we'll move on. No? Maybe Julian, maybe you should write to us all with some information about that. Okay. So I'm just looking down the questions. Lynn Sullivan asks, many organisations, including the National Grid, which obviously is an important part of this conversation, are setting out the business case for lowering energy demand through energy efficiency with a massive investment need for additional grid capacity. In that case, surely the government should go further than the support programmes to the social and fuel poor, instead of direct investment. Now trying to lower the screen. Direct investment in up-to nuclear power stations, where we could have a whole other conversation about that, couldn't we? And I've lost it again. This is the problem with this thing. You can't scroll up and down. I've lost the end of the question. Hold on, I'll try and find it. There we go, found it again. We need more incentives for the lenders and the owners. I think that more or less covers it before I lose it again. Does anybody want to comment on that about energy demand as part of the solution? Aaron?
Yeah, the sixth carbon budget calls for on average 12% across the stock reduction in demand. That's all that they wanted, and that's kind of based on their kind of MAC curves of all. It's basically cheaper to decarbonize elsewhere in the economy, according to the metrics they use. And so a very, very unambitious sort of demand reduction program really is what that means. And I think what wasn't included in all of that is, as we keep saying, all the kind of knock-on benefits to health. You know, it doesn't do a whole lot of good, as David said, to throw a heat pump into someone's home and that's zero carbon if it triples their energy bills and they can't afford to run it. So yeah, I think more and more we need to be making that business case for demand reduction, which we haven't made compellingly enough yet. And I think is why it keeps getting kind of the short end of the stick in a lot of our plans.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, and I know it is in a absolute zero report by UK Fires, and it was in 2019, so it might be slightly out of date there now, but they've got a lovely graph right at the beginning, and it shows the projected energy demand against the projected renewable supply of electricity by 2050, and there's a rather shocking energy gap of probably about 40% between the two. Now that might be slightly out of date now, but it emphasizes that energy demand, if we do not reduce our demand through better insulation, better efficiencies across the board, we're going to have a big energy gap by 2050. So demand reduction has to occur. And I think Lynn was quite right. Rather than all that money that would be spent on infrastructure upgrades, can some of that somehow be found to be redirected into making sure that energy reduction is more efficient across the board? So it's a very pertinent point.
Alex, can I
come in? Yeah.
So I think this perhaps one of the myths that could have been mentioned earlier is the relationship between energy efficiency and ultimately heat decarbonisation. And clearly there is a big relationship between them. And I don't think anybody that works in decarbonising buildings would suggest that you don't want to invest in energy efficiency. However, I think sometimes the debate gets too stretched in that direction. And becomes one of, we need to get every household up to ridiculously high standards of energy efficiency before we start to look at heating solutions. And I think one of the reasons actually that Aaron mentioned the carbon budget 6 trajectory for buildings, one of the reasons that it's not huge amounts of reduction in that time scale is because ultimately 80% of the emissions that we're going to save from buildings are going to come from switching the heat source. And so there's preparatory work to be done in insulating buildings, but ultimately what heat source ends up following, how it's installed, how it's designed, are going to be as important, if not more, than how the building is insulated in the shorter term. And so we need to find a way of having those sort of conversations concurrently, but recognizing that, frankly, our energy system is not ready for 28 million homes on net zero heating systems right now, whether that's because we don't have a grid that can supply hydrogen, or because we don't have networks that can cope with 28 million heat pumps, or because heat networks themselves are probably just going to be applicable to more dense urban areas. We don't have those solutions ready for that scale of rollout, and we won't do. That is a 30-year project. What we shouldn't do in the meantime is get everybody too scared that these technologies are going to come along and they're going to ruin their heating systems, or they're going to put up their bills by 3 times, etc. They probably won't, and if they do, then a different intervention will be appropriate for that household.
Thanks, Daniel. We've got one more, and then hopefully Clive should be here, and we can hear his thoughts from the Select Committee point of view. So somebody with the initials SM says, regardless of net zero scenarios, expected that by 2035 around 2 million homes will be connected to a heat network, a 4-fold increase from where we are today. Obviously in Scandinavia, the majority of people are connected to a heat network. What sort of role do you think heat networks will play in this? We haven't discussed that yet, and we've just expanded ours in Leeds quite significantly, including to the Climate Innovation District, which David mentioned earlier. Maybe, David, you want to start on this one? We think what role heat networks might play?
It's not my particular area of expertise. The challenge always with heat networks is getting that mix of demand and heat inputters and heat outtakers. You need that mix of usage, really, but it's not my area of expertise. But just quickly going back to the previous point on the grid, we've got to remember that if we also have those 28 million properties all with a car sat on the drive that's going to be plugging in as an EV, we're not just talking about the energy demand for heating and cooling your homes, it's also the cars as well. So
yeah,
but I'll pass on further comment on
I agree.
heat network.
I agree about that. Yeah, heat and electricity generation actually is probably less of an issue than the grid's ability to handle the electricity and distribute it. Does anybody want to comment on heat networks? Aaron?
I've always been a big fan of heat networks. I think what we're going to see, I think, and I hope a lot more of, is the kind of 5th generation heat network approach, which is more kind of decentralized. You can use lower distribution temperatures, make better use of renewables and waste heat, and sort of couple things together in a way that avoids, exactly as David said, the big challenge is the long-term planning around the heat demand and the heat supply and all that, and doing it in a more kind of piece-by-piece basis with lower temperatures, smaller loads. You can help overcome some of those. So wherever you see 5th generation heat networks, I'm a big fan of those projects.
Yeah, just a note on sort of policy in this area. I think there's some really exciting stuff coming out of BEIS at the moment on heat network zoning as a model for tackling that exact issue of how you get the confidence to actually build the infrastructure when you've got to match that demand and supply ahead of the actual thing existing. I think there are some real difficulties, some real sort of chicken and egg difficulties there, and I think that probably means that in terms of when we're looking at the top-down picture of how we're going to get all of our buildings to net zero, heat networks tend not to be the sort of the name of the conversation. But if you're looking at it bottom up from a what would be really good for this area, this area, or this area in terms of development, then often they do provide the answer. And I think that really comes to the crux of one of the most difficult questions we haven't spoken about today in policy terms, which is what is the relationship between national policy and local policy in driving heat and buildings decarbonisation, because it is fiendishly difficult but incredibly important, both in terms of the infrastructure requirements that we've talked about, whether that's networks, heat networks, or gas grid changes, but also in terms of the wider local planning and engagement that needs to go around these kind of changes.
I think the other thing that heat networks give us the potential to, I completely agree with that point around national local, it gives more potential for shielding individual homeowners or social housing from increasing price and cost. If it's being managed in a central way, is there some way that actually you could kind of shoulder that cost and focus more on that levelling up?
Thanks, Annabelle. That was a really good answer about, and probably something that we could do a bit more on as well in the UK compared to certain parts of the world where we have heat source, and there's lots of heat source in the UK where the heat just evaporates into the atmosphere, which is very inefficient use of that heat. I was expecting by this point that Clive Betts would have joined us, so I'm now struggling a little bit because I've run out of questions and I've got no Clive. So, but maybe the question is, so we talked a lot about electricity use, energy use, supply of energy, but there are, before that, and the simplest and cheapest, as we all know, way of doing this is to increase insulation homes and reduce leaky homes and inefficient homes before we start thinking about heating the homes. And we've got a question from Andrew Bulmer about leasehold flats, where the communal ownership means that it's very difficult because of the way that charges are implemented. And we've got the same issue with those same leasehold properties around cladding as well, which is slightly separate, but I think related issue, depending what the cladding was put on for. Does anybody, maybe Daniel, have a view on that tricky tricky policy presumption because not a few houses. It's like 20% of the stock, isn't it? So it's a lot of people, a lot of homes.
Yeah, my view is that it's tricky. I'll be honest. We've this is one of those head scratchers because it's obviously important in terms of getting to net zero buildings, but actually it's also part of a much bigger, knottier set of cross-government policy issues, right? Because leaseholds causes all kinds of complications for householders when they want to get work done to their properties. And indeed, I talked earlier about phasing in regulation, for instance, on potentially when you have to sell your home at a certain point, you're going to need to show that you've done certain works. Well, how's that going to work if you can't get consent from your fellow leaseholders? But I think to an extent, sometimes we conflate the kind of the leasehold issue with the fact actually that there's something bigger and more fundamental at play here, which is that more and more of our homes, particularly in cities, are divided up into flats. And that means that you have got lots and lots and lots of buildings which are multiple occupancy. And that means if you're talking about things like wall insulation, difficulties in coordinating with other tenants. And I think, frankly, that is something that is trailing behind the rest of policy thinking in this area. But what's going to be needed is a framework for bringing those parties together at certain trigger points to enable policy to then help them take action. Quite what they are, I don't know yet.
No, I mean, it's even usually when there's a problem, even if it might not be what the government wants, you can normally find a way to legislate for a solution. But actually this, because of consent and people having agency in their own homes, it is difficult to even work out a legislative solution that isn't seen as maybe too invasive into people's lives. Nanny state, I think we used to call it, hopefully not anymore. We are still struggling to get Clive. I think I'm going to get an update now. No Clive. So I think I think maybe actually if if we haven't got any, or we've got a question. So what we'll do is we'll take this question, and if we've got no Clive, then we'll wrap up. And if we've got Clive, we'll bring Clive in. So I think that's the best solution. So Peter Rogers of Sustainable Acoustics. I'm intrigued. Over to you, Peter. Bring Peter in, Louis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, the irony around acoustics and not being heard. Thanks everybody. I just wanted to pick up, I think, some practical points. I've sort of been responding from a perspective of acoustics along the way, but I think we represent one of the sort of interfaces where society interacts with whatever buildings we're putting together. One of the problems with the existing stock and also some of the mega trends is if we could just identify a couple of the key ones. For example, as Daniel just mentioned, the fact that urbanization means that we are needing to live in more and more dense environments. Plan for that, get the solution that works for that. In my situation, there is a massive issue around vibrancy and putting people next to premises and expecting them to be able to sleep, and then the premises being able to function. And of course, that's important for community building and place making, and all of these things are part of well-being and so forth. So what I'm saying is, as we think about things like health and well-being, can we also think about the conflict that creates in terms of the buildings that we are creating in the future as we're living more densely, and if you've got thermal issues and you've got passive house, etc., what happens when it overheats and you have to open your windows in an environment that hasn't really been designed? So all of these things we can deal with in terms of engineering, but it requires some sort of, I mean, they've used the word integrated and holistic, but probably we need to get specifics on that now, perhaps on maybe 5 or 10 trends which would actually help practically.
Things that I never thought about design stage, acoustics is one, but I imagine other people have. Is this something WSP have come up against, David?
Oh, without shadow, all the time. You know, whenever we're designing anything, you know, especially if it's next to a main road artery, you absolutely have to consider the acoustics, and that will impact on the glazing specification and maybe the ventilation solution that you're putting into it. So it is absolutely at the forefront of our minds when we're designing any building, to be honest with you. So, you know, and this is absolutely where a holistic approach is needed. We all, and this goes beyond buildings. So absolutely, you know, if we can be decarbonising our vehicles, that removes, you know, one of the noise sources from vehicles from our city centres in terms of the engine. I know you still have the tyre noise and pollution from tyres, but you know, that not only helps the acoustics, but also the air quality in our city centres and town centres. You know, in the UK, what is it, 30 to 40,000 people a year die from poor air pollution. So, you know, that holistic view to be decarbonising has other health benefits, and we have to incorporate that into everything that we design.
Absolutely. Aaron, have you got a view on this? You look like, yeah.
Yeah, well, I just think the link with acoustics is fascinating to me, very interesting, because so we do a lot of research on this both at LSBU and BSRIA, and what I've always found interesting, I'm not an acoustician, so I'm hearing their knowledge secondhand here, but they describe the impacts of sound quality, not just sound volume, and that there are just so many sounds we've gotten used to, we've kind of become accustomed to, the sound of a boiler, the sound of traffic, as David said, and that all of those sort of trends are about to change. And so there's a lot of really interesting research now on the quality of the sound off of heat pumps and what they sound like and what they sound like together, and how this kind of transforms our communities and our environment. So it's a very interesting area of research, and I think the more of these pilot projects we have out there to sort of study and gather data from, the more we can engage a conversation about what our net zero communities want to be like and should sound like. That's it.
Thanks, Tony. I think you just described all the issues I'm having in my London flat and why I wake up at 2 and 5 a.m. every day. Unfortunately, we haven't got Clive with us, so I think we are gonna wrap up the session maybe slightly early. I'd really like to thank all our speakers today across both the panels. It has been absolutely fascinating. It's such a big area that really is all-encompassing in our lives. We spend most of our times at home. During the lockdown, we spent all of our times at home, so we got really used to our houses and the detriments maybe that existed within them, and the challenges we're going to have in the future. It was a nice point to end on, maybe talking about acoustics, because normally we don't talk about some of those other issues outside of heating your home and the quality of home. Maybe the air quality, internal air quality is a conversation we sometimes have, but not acoustics. We need to think about environment in that global way. And just to say, as a net zero APPG, this is the end of our year, but it's also the end of our myth-busting series of meetings. We're working towards launching our myth-busting report, which is going to pull all of that together, and I think really going to help policymakers in Parliament and people in different industries. I actually had a colleague email yesterday asking about whether we had a myth-busting report on housing and insulation, and today the event came, and so we are really doing timely work, colleagues, in this area, and so we're going to be doing that in the new year, and also we'll have a whole new programme for the Net Zero APPG, and I hope that you can carry on joining these, whether online or hopefully some also down here in the Houses of Parliament as well. So thanks to everybody, and hopefully see you all in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you all.